I am going to be doing the Digital Humanities Pedagogy Workshop, but just for me to get a sense of what you all do, I'd like us to go around the room and introduce yourselves. Are you library? Are you teaching faculty? And what, if any, kind of pedagogy do you do? Like, do you do workshops? Do you do undergrad teaching, grad teaching, things like that? I'm going to pick on Jesus because I know him.
Okay, yeah, I'm a history librarian here, and I haven't done a lot of digital scholarship per se, more like information literacy in terms of finding information, whether the information.
I'm Angela Hockstead, I'm a subject librarian, and I also don't do a lot of digital humanities and digital scholarship yet, but I'm very interested. I think it would apply great for public policy and political science, which are my subjects.
Okay. Rob, can you jump back in?
Rob Nelson. I am in the library at the University of Richmond. I'm not a librarian by training, and I oversee digital scholarship, digital preservation, and digital collections. And right now I am teaching Intro to DH for the first time, and I'm hoping to do it better come Wednesday after fall break because of this presentation.
Well, it's nice to have you in this.
pressure.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to have you in this room because I teach your project in my Intro to DH classes. So we got a recursive loop going here. So over here.
I'm Steve Black. I'm at Colgate University. I'm associate university librarian, and I still do a lot of instruction, and part of my job description is to oversee our institutional repository.
I'm Lindsay Bush, the instructional services librarian from Union College. So basically anything that falls into instruction is my sort of domain, but I do general basic information literacy instruction for the most part, and we are currently trying to figure out how to put digital scholarship into instruction.
I'm Adam Mazo. I'm about a month into being the Digital Scholarship and Instruction Librarian at Union, and I expect I will be teaching digital scholarship.
Hi, I'm Laura Thedro. I'm assistant professor here in the English department. I think we follow each other on Twitter. And my research and teaching is on digital media and activist and political rhetoric.
Thank you.
I'm Bridget Weirdy. I'm in the Medieval Studies program and English department at Binghamton. Digital pedagogy has not been incorporated very much, so I'm really excited to do that. And I do a lot of information literacy instruction embedded in medieval studies classes because that's what I can do at this point. So.
Tyler, University Libraries Administrator, but I focus a lot on undergraduate outreach and programs, workshops.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming. Just as background for my my experience with teaching, I've taught an Intro to DH class 4 times in my 6 years here at UAlbany. Once I've taught an Intro to DH class just for undergraduates, and then I've also, in those graduate classes that I've taught, had undergraduates mixed in. And I'm going to talk a bit about why that's not a great idea. That is not my preferred way to do these kinds of classes. I'm on Twitter, as some of you already know, Maeve Kane. Please do feel free to tweet anything about this or images from the slides. Feel free to contact me by email, and my slides, if you want them later, are up at maevekane.net/digiped. So do, as well as some links to some things I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to start us off, and I'm going to make us do that most dreaded of classroom activities, which is talk to each other, because this is how I start the first day of class for both my grad and my undergrad classes. So I'm going to ask us to do, I'm going to make this difficult and make it bigger groups. So I'm going to do a group of 3, and then a group of 4 over here. So there's a rule for this. So what I want you to do is in your groups, your small groups, come up with one rule to put all of these fruits into different baskets. There has to be at least 2 baskets. And you can't have 1 fruit per basket. So you can't have like 12 baskets with 1 fruit each in it. So one rule has to have at least 2 baskets, and every fruit has to go into a basket. And then we'll come back and talk about what our rules are in a minute here. We ready? Okay, so group 1, what's your rule?
Basically, I mean, 3 groups: trees, bushes, vines.
Okay. So mode of growth.
Yeah.
Are you guys one group across the table here?
Yeah, we didn't.
What's your rule?
Go ahead.
Just if it has berry in the name of it,
Okay.
that's one group, and then the non-berries, that's the other group.
So we've got 3 baskets here, we've got 2 baskets here, and then what about in the back? Got it?
warm colors and cold colors.
Okay, so based on color. So the reason I do this on the first day of a digital history class or a digital humanities class is to emphasize, A, the most important work that students are going to do in a DH class should be talking to each other face to face, and actually the conceptual work of how they're making their choices rather than the like in front of the computer work that they're doing. The other reason that I do this, a lot of students have at least some experience with like sorting or the idea of data, like quantitative data tends to be a place that students tend to have experience with. And even within working with the same exact data and a relatively small data set, we've already got 3 different ways of asking questions about this data. And the questions that you ask, or the one rule that you use to categorize your data, leads you to different research results. So like our botanical categorization of tree, bush, vine is going to let us answer a very different question than our color question. I sometimes also get groups that identify that the fruits on the top are native to North America, the fruits in the middle are native to the Americas and Europe, and then the other ones are a bit more exotic, are indigenous to Asia and parts of Eurasia. So the cultural background that you bring to this also determines how you're slicing up your data. And I think that's important to emphasize in the first day of class for students, because for humanities students, they often come to these kinds of courses, or at least in my experience, they come to these courses thinking like, I have no background in this, I have absolutely zero idea what I'm doing, and they have a lot of this like learned helplessness with regards to computers. And I think it's really useful to emphasize to them like, no, you're good at the most important step of this, which is understanding context and making connections, as well as seeing patterns. So I think that that helps set up a bunch of the later lessons that I want them to take out of this class. You guys also said that you were Googling kumquats. Why is that?
We didn't know if they grew on trees or bushes.
So how to categorize it. Did anybody else have to look up kumquats or anything else?
We had one person in our group said they didn't know what huckleberries look like, but I'm from Montana, so.
Good, yeah, so we're drawing on others' resources. I throw some of the odder ones like huckleberries and kumquats in there in this activity to emphasize to students that like, if you have a data set sitting in front of you, you're not always going to understand it immediately. Sometimes you have to, and I tell them to whip out their phones and Google it. Like sometimes you have to do more research to contextualize your data, or to even know how to categorize or slice your data. So I try to structure the class around like, what are the humanities lessons that you want them to take out of this class, rather than the technological skills that you want them to take away, because they'll get to the skills eventually. Because in my experience, and those of you that have done technical skills workshops, either as a student or as an instructor, students don't really know what to make of this a lot of times. Especially with undergrads, my experience is that they see Intro to Digital Humanities and they think that they're taking a course on like internet culture in 2010 or 2019. And graduate students, if they've heard of digital humanities, think of it as like a job skills training thing, which it in part should be, but they don't think about the conceptual work that DH skills can do for them, or help them ask new questions about their discipline. And I think those disciplinary questions are more important than whatever job skills they hopefully also acquire. And in line with this, this workshop today is a lot of the advice that I wish I had been given before I taught a DH class for the first time. I taught my first DH class here the spring after I graduated from a history PhD program where I had no DH training of my own. I was entirely self-taught. I was much less ambitious than I think I could have been. And by ambitious, I mean the kinds of both technical skills and the kinds of conceptual skills that you can push students to acquire. I was very conservative the first time that I taught a DH class in just kind of doing the basics of like, what is a website? How do you install a website? How do you publish things online? And I think there's a lot more you can do based on that. But in order to tie all of this together, and this is part of being ambitious, I think that it still does, or students do still need content and narrative takeaway. So when I'm an early Americanist, my students are mostly not early Americanists, but I do push them really hard to engage with the early America content subject matter, because I think that that helps them take away like what use does DH do in a disciplinary context. And to that end, I have them read a lot of journal articles that use DH methods to make a historiographic point, because I think that it's really hard for them to see like what difference does doing this work actually make in a scholarly conversation without that context. So they may not understand the full scholarly conversation, but at least they can see how scholars are using it in context. And please, if you have questions as I'm moving along, please do interrupt at any time. So some of the stuff that I wish I had done earlier, I said be ambitious, but the caveat to that is also really, really scaffold the basics. I have had more students than I thought who don't understand basic file folder structure on a computer, or they don't understand how to search for a file on their own computers. And I was, like, one of the most important things as a either instructor in a workshop context or an instructor in a full semester context, I think, is to not make the students feel dumb because they already come into the class with that baggage, especially if they're humanities students. In part, I think that's due to some of the student population here. Like Albany has a large first generation population, a large minority student population, a large commuter student population. And they have gotten, a lot of them have gotten where they are by not taking risks. They've succeeded by doing the things that they know that they're already good at. And part of the risk of a DH class, whether that's an individual session or a semester length session, is that they feel like if they take too many risks on things that they don't think that they're good at, they think they will fail the class. So you have to build in, at least for the student population that I have experience with, you have to build in structures that help them succeed, which is scaffolding like basic skills of how do you navigate a computer, as well as like confidence building things. I do for both of my my grad and undergrad class, I do a basic like, how do you do a spreadsheet? How do you manipulate a spreadsheet? How do you get information out of a spreadsheet? And they are terrified of that assignment. They hate it. It's like the most teeth-pulling assignment of the whole semester. And I think they look back on it and it's just like the worst thing that I've made them do. But by the time we get to the end of the semester, they're like, oh, I'm just like gonna do all of this stuff with OpenRefine and manipulate the spreadsheet and it's fine. But they're just absolutely terrified of that first step because it's such a big risk in the context of what they've done before. So depending on your student population, you have to kind of build in how to fail, how to manage their frustration, and how to troubleshoot their own things. I also tell my students the first week of class that the most important skill that they'll get out of my classes is how to Google something, because a lot of them, like, part of the risk-taking that they have learned to shy away from has been, if you hit a wall with it, give up and stop, like especially with regard to computer things. Like even if they own a computer, even if like they think of themselves as like people who do a lot of video games or whatever, they tend to hit that first roadblock on the spreadsheets assignment and just be like, I can't figure it out, I'm not good at computers. And I think that not good at computers roadblock is a very common one for humanities students. And I would also say explicitly explain why they're learning this. This is for both a DH classroom, like an intro to DH semester length course, as well as if you do a DH assignment in a content course that's not a DH course. Because this goes back to like, is this job skills? Is this a conceptual thing? Like if you want them to take away like why this helps them think through in a different way, you have to really explicitly walk them through what are they learning. Like even at the graduate level, I found students can really reliably say like, oh, I learned how to do formulas in a spreadsheet, I learned how to clean data in OpenRefine, I learned how to do quantitative analysis, but they can't talk through really explicitly of like, okay, what does doing network analysis do for your scholarship? Like why would you care about networks? What does categorizing data in different ways do for the way that you think about that data? So you have to really explicitly walk them through things. Any thoughts or questions so far? Stuff I wish I hadn't done. Community service is a huge time suck. Don't do it, at least not pre-tenure, or if you're not in a tenure stream position. In almost all of my DH classes, I have done some kind of community service project where we are transcribing something, where we are putting up, like doing some kind of service-based learning project. And I'm gonna real quick. So not to toot my own horn, but this is an award-winning project that won a UAlbany President's Award for Public Engagement. I wish I had not done this. This was for one of those classes that, for both an undergrad class and a grad class, we wrote digital walking tours on an Omeka platform for the local YMCA. It was a project to try to get people out into the neighborhoods, see the local history, and especially minority history in Albany. It was a huge time suck. Like, it's wonderful. I'm glad that I made those community connections, but like the setup for that project was more intensive than any project that I've done since. I have not done another project with, or another class with this project. It continues to be a big time suck because the YMCA needs technical support on my end. So I would say if you can avoid doing community engagement projects before tenure, do so if at all possible. The other 2 points of this are less general. They are more about knowing your own student population. I have found that a large emphasis on digitization or making online exhibits through Omeka doesn't serve my student population's needs. And this is one of the things that I've only gotten with the benefit of hindsight, of having, I now have 4 years worth of alumni who are out working in communities, and they are much better about keeping in touch than the other alumni that I've had. And they do frequently write back of like, hey, I'm using this skill in a class, and that has, or in this project that I'm doing at work that we did in class. And the only things that I have not heard back about are Omeka and digitization. Like, even for the students that have gone on to like museums and libraries where they're working in digitization, it's such a specialized field that, like, unless you're spending an entire class on that, I think that they get better training on the job or in a specific class. So in an intro to DH class, I have stopped teaching that. And student-owned websites is similar. Like, they don't often write back that they need to set up their own websites because they're usually working in the context of like an institutional website. And for a personal thing, it's less intensive these days. As far as lesson structuring, this is my terrible secret because only Susan is here from my department. I put a lot more thought into my lesson structuring for DH classes than I do for my regular content classes or for my DH assignments in a content class. And this goes back to like know your students and know what they need. Over the years, I've put more explicit discussion in the assignment themselves of like, what are you getting out of this? What kind of mode of thought does this teach as they're moving through the assignment in ways that I have been doing in content assignments for other classes, but has been less explicit in the past. And I try to, I guess I should actually pull this down so you guys can see this. I try to structure my DH lessons around a cycle of plan, do, and reflect. So they have to like emphasize that, talk to people, plan it out, understand what you're doing, rather than just go through like, okay, if I paste this in here, or if I do this explicit step that Professor Kane says I have to do, then the thing will work. Because I find that they can do the technical skills steps, but they don't understand it going back later. And similarly, I don't do any teaching in the last half of the semester for a DH class. And by that I mean I leave it open, our class time is completely open for workshop time for them to work on a final project that uses one method in depth, and I kind of float around the room answering questions, because I have found that that's like the only way to get things to sink in. If they just kind of go through a bunch of assignments where all of the steps are written out for them, none of it sticks. Like I'm a big believer in, for a lot of this hands-on stuff, it really has to be hands-on in order for it to stick for them. So in many ways, DH classes I found are a huge time suck on the setup end. I do much more prep ahead of time for any of these than I do for my other classes before the semester starts. But during the semester, it's usually a lot more in-class time of like getting the ball rolling and answering questions rather than like lecture prep. And I would say also think about, as far as knowing your students, do you want to emphasize for them content creation, scholarly intervention or the technical skills, because at least in my experience, I have not been able to do all three well all at once. And that goes in part to digital humanities as both a method of analysis, like you can do different kinds of analysis with digital methods, but it's also a publishing mode. So you have to think about, do I want students to get out of this that they can put things online? Do I want them to get out of this that they can do analysis that will change a scholarly conversation? Or do I want them to get the skills of like data cleaning with regular expressions? And unfortunately, Jesus is in the room, so I'm not gonna slam the university too much, but I would also say, plan on having no financial and technical support. Jesus has been my technical support for teaching things like Zotero in these classes in the past. But the Albany does not do any support as far as like any of my course websites. The university doesn't host or even pay for that. The university doesn't provide IT professionals to answer questions about why is my JavaScript library not embedding on my course website. So plan on when you're doing your any kind of lesson prep or lesson structuring, having absolutely zero financial support or technical support, and then if somebody will come in and help you with something like Zotero, then that's a nice bonus.
I do have a question on
Yeah.
that. So, speaking of Zotero, I wonder myself whether that really falls under the umbrella of digital scholarship. So I guess it does.
I
think you taught that in connection with Omeka, right?
Yeah, yeah. I taught it in the past when I was teaching Omeka because Omeka has an integration feature to import a Zotero library. I have stopped teaching it in my DH classes, but I have begun teaching it more in like my regular grad seminars or my undergraduate content classes because it's not really an analytical mode and it's not really a publishing mode, so yeah.
And here we teach more in the capstone,
Right.
when students have to come up with a bibliography. So I think in our case, it makes more sense to teach in the capstone than
Right.
your classes.
Yeah, so this is also part of like where does what you're teaching fit into the rest of your curriculum, or if you're doing an instructional workshop, like where does that fit into where students will encounter that in their career? As far as a non-digital humanities class, like if you're thinking about a digital humanities assignment in a more mainstream content classroom, excuse me, again, what is this supposed to do? Like, what is this supposed to help students contextualize? And be extremely, extremely flexible about these, because in my experience, something almost always goes wrong. And if you're doing this in a kind of normal class setting that they don't have computers right in front of them, you have to plan on giving them classroom access. At least for the student population that I work with, it is not guaranteed that they have a laptop access outside of school. This is a digital assignment that I do pretty often with my undergraduate classes. This is timeline.js, and this is a multi-authored timeline that students can build collaboratively, and you can kind of theme. I don't know how well you guys can see this. Yeah. So we had some major themes for this. Was a Native American history class, topics related to land, to war, to treaties, to law, and to removal. The students identified those, and this goes back to how do you categorize your data and how do your categories matter. And this was throughout the semester, students authored these little timeline blurbs. I required them to integrate these events that were authored by other students into papers later in the semester. They also studied from this for a couple of exams. So they were essentially writing their exam themselves as they did this. And if you can do a grade book, you can do this, because this just feeds off of a publicly accessible, if I can figure out what I'm doing here. Oh, come on. Trying to zoom out here. This feeds off of a publicly accessible Google Doc. Timeline.js is published through the Knight Laboratory. And if you can set up a publicly accessible spreadsheet for all students to go in and author, it automatically updates that interactive timeline where you've got it published. So it's a nice and easy little thing to kind of integrate. For my students, I use this to emphasize kind of how our course is organized. For both my colonial U.S. history class and for my Native American history class. It covers a huge time sweep, and students have a hard time kind of organizing all of those things together. So one of the things that doing a timeline activity like that does is it makes them understand how things fit together, and it gives them a point of reference to go back to later in the semester. So there's lots and lots of tools. I'm not gonna run through a bunch of the options because there's just like, we can spend a huge amount of time on different options, and I'm happy to be in contact with folks afterwards. But like, the organizing goal should be what do you want them to get out of it, rather than what does the tool itself do, because I think that leads to frustration for students. In a digital history classroom or a digital humanities classroom itself, I think the most important things, because students are so risk averse and because students are so, I'm not good at computers, I really think play and community matters. So during workshop time, I play really bad dubstep so that they have a cover if they want to ask a question, like there's music going so nobody else across the room is going to hear what their question is. I also do, one of my first activities in a DH class is write a basic HTML and CSS flavored website. And you can walk through this here, but I'm going to open this one. I give a prize of like a sticker to the student that can make the most hideous website, because like they should be doing this because it's enjoyable. They get the benefit of like, I also give them a little prize if they figure out how to do something with HTML and CSS that I don't teach them explicitly in the lesson, so it incentivizes them to like go out and figure things out themselves, that Google step. But like, it should be fun. It should be an interesting thing for them rather than like plodding through a set of steps. Because I think that like, as much as both my grad and undergrad students hate that first spreadsheet assignment, it really is a community bonding moment, especially for students who like think that they're not good at computers and they can pull through and do that first spreadsheet assignment. Like, community, I think, in a DH classroom makes or breaks a class much more than other classes. And I also do a little bit with them the first weeks of class of like, how does your body language signal how you're communicating with people? So like, when I'm talking to a student, if a student has like a laptop here or a student has a question, I do not stand up and talk to that student, and I encourage them to not do that with each other if they're talking to folks. Whenever I'm teaching a DH class or somebody has a question, I try to get down on eye level, because it like, that reinforces that power dynamic in the classroom of like, you're the student being talked down to. And I also tell them often like, I don't know what's going wrong. I'm gonna have to Google that, or we're gonna have to meet outside of class to figure out what's going on. Because like, they have this feeling that like, the professor that's teaching this like magically knows all this technical skills, and it's as much of a process for us as it is for them. And finally, building in the wow factor of like, try to structure assignments around, or their final projects around, they can take this away and feel like, I did something really cool. Like, how do you incentivize them to find those things? Oh, how do you incentivize them to carry that forward? And part of that is figuring out the tools that you'll be able to teach easily, or figure out what a semester length project looks like for what you want to do. Part of the reason that I spend the last half of my semester on just workshop time around a final project for both grad and undergrad is it gives them the time to do something really cool. So this is a graduate project by one of my students, actually one who's presenting at the poster session later today. And this is, he did a digital analysis of the transatlantic slave trade database that has their data all available freely online. But he had the time to explore whether or not this is going to be a useful data set for his dissertation moving forward. And he had the time to build something where this is not going to go now. That's the other thing in a digital humanities classroom, something always goes wrong. But he had the time to build something that you could actually see how the trade changes over time, like what nations are participating, and build in a bit of, this is the problem with the wow factor, then you're dependent on it actually being a wow. But to build in like all of these different modes of analysis for his project. This is an undergraduate project looking at a collection of photographs that are in the Adirondacks. And her data analysis here is from a program called Tableau that I think is one of the friendliest things for both grads and undergrads. But the rest of this, she hand-coded in all of the rest of this. She's an art and English double major, and she built in kind of the artistic portion of this by hand. So I think giving them the structure to really take away something that they can identify with and be encouraged that their skills actually produce something cool at the end of the semester encourages them to carry it forward. So about half of the poster presenters today are my grad students from the last time I taught this class. And some of them were not sure if they were going to incorporate it into the dissertation when they took the class. 2 or 3 of them now are planning on doing digital methods with the dissertation. So I think there is kind of a conversion factor there. And finally, as far as resources, steal the heck out of other people's stuff. Don't try to write a digital syllabus on your own, and think about one of the nice things about the digital humanities community is that a lot of people put their materials out online or talk about really explicitly how and why they structured assignments or workshops in specific ways. And those are incredibly helpful for thinking about structuring your own stuff. And I've also linked, for the purposes of stealing my own stuff there, both my grad and my undergrad syllabi. So you're welcome to use those moving forward. So we've got about 20 minutes till the end of our period. So if folks have questions or thoughts, I'm more than happy to talk. Or talk less.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
So I'm Regina, I head the Innovate, Make, Create Center. So we do a lot of workshops. Is there something you'd recommend we do that would benefit students? Tableau you mentioned, I don't know if
Yeah,
that's...
I love Tableau. I think it's incredibly useful across disciplines. The other thing that students have often told me that they use a lot after graduating, but not as much during school, is OpenRefine and data cleaning. That has been especially for PhD students, OpenRefine is eye-openingly magic. So I would suggest OpenRefine and Tableau, I think, are the biggest ones that a library center could offer that I think would be useful across disciplines.
Okay.
And as far as being ambitious, I taught OpenRefine, which is a program for kind of cleaning and regularizing a large spreadsheet. I taught that for several years, but I didn't teach what I think is both the most daunting, but also the most useful thing about OpenRefine, which is regular expressions. This is not quite a programming language, but it's a way of manipulating text that you can find very abstracted patterns and then change them into something else specific. And the usefulness of that for my PhD students has been amazing. They have been using it in a bunch of other settings. That's something that I don't think would be as useful for the undergraduate students, but this goes to knowing your population. My PhD students are very interested in using quantitative data, and they have found that to be just transformative because they can pull in a bunch of data from government websites or other historians' data that is shared in different places and use it in different ways than would have been possible if it had just been the unclean mess that gets dumped on the internet by a government agency or whatever. Yeah, Bridget.
I have a follow-up question to something you mentioned earlier, which was that you felt like an entirely undergraduate focused class worked well and an entirely grad student class worked well, but the mix wasn't great.
Yeah.
And I think as we start to try to build intro DH classes at Binghamton, there's going to be a lot of pressure to make them mixed classes, and I really like your thoughts on this.
Yeah, we do it because we need a certain number of undergrad classes offered every semester, and if I'm teaching both a grad readings class and a grad DH class, that's unfair to my colleagues who are only teaching one readings class.
Sure.
And then it cuts down on the number of undergrad classes we teach. I don't like it because I think it makes it very, very difficult for the undergrads. They come in, when I teach a joint meeting grad and undergrad class, the undergrads have a lot less work, they have a lot less reading, it is scaled back to an undergrad level. But I think it's difficult for them because even if I don't ask students to identify themselves of like what program they're in, they know. They know when there's like the PhD students in the room, even if they haven't had them as like TAs or whatever. So they come in with yet another hurdle in front of that I'm not good at computers. It's also I'm not good at computers, and there's also PhD students here, and I'm going to be compared with them. And I also feel like because I do a lot of emphasis on like face-to-face discussion and like actually talking and planning away from the computers, as much as I try to rein it back to a level that's accessible for the undergrads, the discussion often is at a much higher level than what they're used to. For us, the undergrad course code is at a 400 level, which should be equivalent to our senior capstone, but we don't have any gate on it. If you're looking at instituting it in a new program, I would say let the instructor give a permission number for it, because I've definitely had undergrads that I've had in other classes where I'm like, yes, you should take this class, you can do that level of work. But we have no mechanism for like, I've had sophomores taking their gen ed credit in this class. I'm like, you should not be here in this class, you will be miserable. And they've done okay work, and many of them have risen to the challenge, but like I have no mechanism of actually saying like, this is not an okay class for your gen ed credit. But they stick in because it's the only class that fits my schedule, which I don't think is a good reason to do it. I teach a 200 level undergrad class occasionally, and I think that's a much more appropriate, like, if you're gonna do a gen ed, then that's fine for a gen ed. But there has to be some kind of mechanism, hopefully, of kind of gatekeeping who's in and who's out if you're gonna do it dual offer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you ever incorporate any statistical analysis, or is that beyond our ken?
I do like statistics light. I don't do like STATA or SPSS or anything like that. I do talk them through some of the basics of like, what is an average? What is a median? What does it mean if you're doing percentiles versus like raw numbers? Because I'm working with history students that mostly have no background in that, and if they took stats at all, it was probably in high school. Like most of them don't even have a college background. So I do some of the kind of very basic stuff. But for me, it's beyond the scope of a lot of what else I've been doing. But I think that goes to like knowing what your student population is.
What do you do or is there any issues where you have contributing collectively, but with individual responsibilities to a collective site, and some of the work probably is crappy?
Yeah.
And it still ends up like, if it's a public history site, your walking site, is that a concern, like having something out there that your name's on,
Yeah.
associated with your class, and it's kind of junk?
So with the timeline one, where it's like only for use in our class, I use peer pressure a lot. I tell them like, everybody else in class is gonna know who authored this. You are the resource that people are gonna be using for studying for the exam. And that has usually worked. I've usually more had an issue with this kind of assignment of they just kind of ghost the class and don't do their portion, in which case I like take that off the exam or whatever. For something like the walking path site, there's a mechanism built into Omeka where it can be posted, but it's not live. So I do tell them like, if it's not B work or higher, I'm not gonna publish it online. So like they still have to publish it, but like I have only had 1 or 2 students that have not like really risen to the challenge. And they're students I think who are not gonna do great work anyway. But yeah, there is a mechanism on a lot of these of like post but not publish, because yeah, that issue exactly. Yeah.
How to deal with the students that apprehension about, I don't know computer, I cannot good at it, but I'm feeling the same challenge myself. As soon as we talk about the data research, accessing articles, getting some numbers, immediate like, I don't like that, I want to be involved with this. I'm trying many different tactics to be able to let them get comfortable with it. I even do sometimes like a little beat activity that I told them to categorize beads to the metals and plastic glass or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
And then I give them a magnet to move out the metal ones and put them aside.
Yeah.
Show them how easy that is as a tactic. You can do same thing on computer, you can do filtering and stuff like that. But it's still an everyday challenge. So is there any kind of specific tactics you do to get to that?
A lot of scaffolding, just a lot of scaffolding. I put a lot of emphasis on that first spreadsheet assignment of like, how do you do a sum? How do you write a formula to find the maximum number in a column? Like, I spend a lot more time on that in the most recent iterations of my classes than I did when I was first teaching that. Because I find that as much as they hate it, like having to go through that, like they see why they need to do that in like Tableau or OpenRefine or the other projects that we used. And I also do a lot of structuring of like, hey, remember when you guys hated that spreadsheet assignment? I know it sucked, but now we're using it again. So I think it, like, knowing your own syllabus and knowing like how to scaffold so that they have to use those skills again and again, like they will hate it the first time, but they will be grateful by the end of the semester. Like, especially if they can see like, oh, having done that one thing that was kind of basic but really painful at the beginning of the semester, has allowed me to do all of these other like cool wow factor things. So I think explicitly calling their attention back to that helps build their confidence of like, I understand why I had to do that now. Yeah.
Yeah, this has been really helpful in terms of sort of understanding how to manage the student confidence. But I'm curious about sort of the flip side about sort of managing, or if you've ever taught tools that maybe you're sort of new to or unfamiliar with, and how do you manage expectations on mastery and yeah.
Yeah, I always try to tell them straight up when I'm not super comfortable with something. I think that the single best classroom experience I've had with a lesson was teaching regular expressions, which I use often, but I am not super comfortable with. And I was really upfront with them of like, I think this is a really important skill, but I may not be able to answer all of your questions. But like, one of the things that I want you to get out of this class is, how do you continue to learn? How do you continue to teach yourself new skills? Because like, and this is also part of what I tell them up front, like, you may not be using Tableau in 5 years. You may not be using any of the programs that we're using in class, but if you have that process of like learning how to learn and learning how to troubleshoot, which sometimes you will see me do in class, and they do often see me do that in class, that's part of the skills that they need to take away from that class. So yeah, I try to be much more explicit with them in a DH class than I am about other things, or other classes. Any other questions about doing DH assignments in a more content class or a mainstream class? I know a couple of you. Yeah, Bridget.
Actually, can you just tell us sort of how much, this is so boring and geeky, I'm sorry, like how much of the final grade do you have a DH assignment in a sort of analog class?
Yeah.
B, because like the anxiety level, I'm just imagining
Yeah.
what that might be like to manage.
So the last time I did this, I teach a History of Native America class from the peopling of the Americas to the present. That's a 300 level junior senior class for our history majors. The last time I taught that, I did 3 small assignments and then a final paper. And for the 3 assignments, they had, one of them was an individual timeline, like the course-wide one that I showed you. One was a map project with, they had to do a digital map that has a story map is the product. And then one was a digital exhibit. And I graded those the same way that I would grade like any short paper in a class, where I think it was like 5 to 10% for each of the 3 and then 20% for the final paper. And they had the option of doing a regular final paper or doing a digital paper. And the vast majority of them did a digital project for their final project. So I also try to, when I do a DH project in a analog class, I try to emphasize that like they will not be graded on technological failures. So like I had our first assignment with the maps project, I had a lot of projects where like the text was there but the map didn't work. And in part that didn't work because I didn't explain something well when we had our workshop time. So I've found that like emphasizing that a technical failure will not result in a failing grade for the paper is really important for allaying their fears. Like I do when I have a digital assignment in a regular class, like do a lot more reassurance than I do in like with a regular paper.
Yeah. A question related to that, like, so when you teach a digital project as like optional, like how do you time to spend teaching how to make the project, given that not all students might do it? Because that's something I struggle with.
Yeah, I always require them to do at least one, so that like if I do 3 assignments and the second 2 have an option of a digital project, the first one is digital for everybody. So I know at least they're like getting those skills somewhere, or have an opportunity to practice, and then they can opt out if they don't like it. But I do require it for everyone because of that issue of like, I don't want to spend the class time of booking the computer lab and like however much lab time we have, and then have them not actually use it. Yeah.
Do you want to brag on some more student projects that you're really excited about?
Sure, let me see if I can. So 3 of the posters are going to be at the 2:45 session are projects that came out of the last time that I taught this digital history grad class. Close up all of these things. I will say if you do a undergraduate project, in my experience it works much better to kind of limit their options. Undergraduates have the issue of being spoiled for choice or like getting too lost in too many choices. Yeah, here we go. So when I teach this for an undergraduate class, I usually theme it around the early history of Albany, and I try to, here we go. Try to make it so that they have to choose within a couple of data sets, so that it's like they can see what other people are doing. They can kind of get feedback from each other within a semester. So like this is a visualization of the early wards of the city of Albany, and Ryan did visualizations of like how many households had 11 enslaved people in them. How many households had only 2 or fewer enslaved people in them. Where is this? Yeah. And the average number of occupants per household. So like there's an average number of about 3 people per household, but many of those are white men and white women, and relatively few households have enslaved people. And that came out of conversation with the other students in this class of like, what are the interesting questions to investigate? So like it wasn't a group project, but they were able to kind of ask more complicated questions because they could see other people exploring different dimensions of the data. For graduate students, where did this go? For graduate students, I give them the option of working with sample data sets that I've pulled together that I know have like interesting questions in them, much like I do with the undergraduates. But I also give them the option of, give them the option of pulling together their own data set. So like this project on art in the Adirondacks, like she went and made her own data set, which I strongly discourage because this is part of the reason I also don't teach digitization very much. The first couple of times I taught this class, I actually like gave them the option of going up to special collections here at UAlbany and like digitizing or finding their data in special collections information, and it ended up with a lot of frustration because like trying to find a data set and build it, especially from like materials that aren't photographed or transcribed or anything, is a huge time suck for students. So they got a sense of like why these projects are so difficult, which I think was a valuable lesson, but they weren't able within the scope of a semester to really build a project itself. So I build in a checkpoint now of like, so this student was able to find the National Archives digitized Vietnam War casualty list. That was not one of my pre-approved ones, but he was able to find that, and here we go. Do some interesting work on the distribution of casualties relative to population during the Vietnam War. And I built in some checkpoints of like, if you want to use a data set that I'm not providing, you have to give me like a detailed description of how much of it is there, what is it, what's in it, what are you going to do with it, to kind of build in a fail-safe for like, oh, actually this is not gonna work for you. Like I had a student last semester who ended up doing a very interesting project, but came in with the idea that like, I want to transcribe myself these transcripts of piracy trials from the 17th and 18th century and pull out the data from that. And it ended up not being a workable project because there's only about less than 200 of them, the transcribing takes forever, and there was not really comparable data across those 200. So they have to be able to articulate like what kind of patterns are even possible in this data before they propose to work on this, so that they don't get kind of too far down the rabbit hole. So I do a lot of quantitative type of work. I don't do as much like text analysis or topic modeling or anything for their final projects, in part because that's really far outside of my comfort zone. And this is kind of more of my comfort zone. I do mostly network analysis, but students find that extremely frightening. They shy away from that quite a lot. So I've never yet had a student do a network analysis project for their final project.
Question. So yeah, I'm much more of a qualitative person. So anything quantitative is like way outside of my comfort zone. So do you have any when you have students, like for example, who are maybe more interested, grad students more interested in doing a qualitative digital humanities project? Do you have like tools or resources you recommend to them? Or is that not something you cover as much?
I don't as much, in part because of what my comfort zones are. I came into BH doing quantitative and network stuff, so I don't do quite as much at the other end. Yeah, I mean, like, what would you consider a qualitative DH project?
I don't know.
Yeah, I strongly discourage students against doing things like exhibits or archives type projects, which I think are very important and valid DH projects, but I think they're not really doable within the scope of a semester length project. Like it's really hard to say like, I want to build an archive of like, you know, these digitized objects out of special collections and have that be a significant project for a semester length course. I tend to focus more on this stuff and like maps because I think it gives them a little more payoff for the time they have in the scope of the course. But I didn't really understand that until I had taught the class a couple of times. So I think it also comes down to like, how much time do you actually have in your semester and for your course structure to actually pull off something. But like, I have had very good luck with students who think that they're more qualitatively inclined with the quantitative and especially map stuff, because they can ask a lot of those similar questions about the quantitative data. So I put a lot of emphasis on the quantitative stuff with my students because they're scared of it. But I think they're scared of it because they don't understand how much the skills are translatable. So.
I would say topic modeling or any text mining, right? Because there's a quantitative step, obviously, to generate models, but usually the output is much worse that they self-interpret, right? And then there is a kind of qualitative dimension to that, and it's qualitative in nature, that analysis. And I'm particularly thinking of Lisa Rohde's work on Pavlov and poetry and figurative language, which is, I'm actually teaching my students here in a few weeks. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to like the flexibility of DH as a discipline. Like there are so many methods within the umbrella these days that like you could focus a class in a lot of different ways. Susan?
Oh, just a housekeeping kind of question. Aside from the undergrad mix, what was the largest class you taught? And what was the smallest, and what do you think is the ideal?
Let's see. So biggest class that I've ever taught was a purely undergrad class of 35. I think that was way too big, way too big. My biggest grad class was 23, and that included 4 undergrads. And the smallest one that I've taught here was, I think, 12 of grad only. And honestly, I would say something in the range of like 10 or 12 would be more ideal. I have had good experiences with those bigger classes, but I feel like especially the students who are a little more trepidatious kind of get lost in the woodwork sometimes. I have to make a much bigger effort to kind of make sure that that I touch base with them during the semester versus like the students who are going to talk a lot or the students that are going to talk a lot in any class. But it's much easier for students to get lost in kind of a more technical workshop class. I think we got time for about one more question or one more thought. We'll go see all of my my grad students' awesome posters in the poster session. There's 3 of them. One's doing the transatlantic slave trade, one's doing shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, and one is doing Russian industrial development in the 20th century. And then I have another grad student who took the class but is presenting about work that she's doing in her job here. So make sure to go say hello to them because they do wonderful work. Thank you all for coming, and please be in touch.